Weapons have existed as long as humankind. For millennia, they have determined the destiny of generations. Weapons bring suffering and death. They show what humans can inflict upon other humans. But they're also intended to keep the peace and pave new ways for technology. We will present 3 weapons that have made war history because almost anyone can handle them without long hours of training. Astonishing experiments will reveal their secrets. The Kalashnikov, a tool for soldiers and terrorists, the most widespread firearm in the world.
This is a violent gun to shoot on full auto.
The Crossbow, sophisticated engineering for untrained warriors.
I've been firing this weapon for years, but still I'm running on adrenaline.
And the Pike, the wonder weapon against medieval knights.
That is very, very intimidating.
This weapon is a deadly instrument in the hands of ordinary men against mounted knights. In the Middle Ages and early modern history, it's called a pike. In the classical era, the long wooden spear is known as sarissa. The Battle of Issus, 333 BCE. Persian King Darius III confronts the Macedonian ruler Alexander. An uneven showdown, or so it appears. But besides a heavy cavalry and infantry in phalanx formation, Alexander has another ace up his sleeve: very long wooden spears, an invention by Philip II of Macedon, his father.
They were using very long pikes, and it was essential that they maintain cohesion and they all fought in the same way. The temptation to put the pike down and fight with the sword had to be resisted.
Alexander's troops have undergone intensive sarissa training. Their length alone of about 6 meters makes the wooden spears a terrifying weapon. Even more so when used in a formation with hundreds of warriors all lined up. In the Battle of Issus, deploying the sarissa pays off for the Macedonians.
It enables you to keep the enemy at a distance, and as long as you maintain formation, you can press the enemy backwards. He simply cannot get close to you to attack. So you're using your range of action to drive the enemy off the battlefield.
Alexander and the Macedonians prevail. Darius loses the battle. The once omnipotent Persian Empire is doomed. A turning point in history. The sarissa remains a characteristic weapon of the Hellenistic world. It's only after the Romans defeat the Macedonians that the long spear falls by the wayside. More than 1,000 years later, in the Middle Ages, it is rediscovered and conquers the battlefields again. Nykøbing Falster, Denmark. On the set of a reconstructed medieval village, experts investigate historical technologies and weaponry. The pike is particularly interesting. Weapons expert Mike Loades has exhaustively examined its changeful success story.
The pike's probably one of the simplest weapons ever devised. It's no more than a long pole with a sharp head. On its own, though, it's not a very useful weapon. On its own, as soon as somebody is inside that point, they can attack you, and it's clumsy to fight with. But it wasn't used on its own. It was used with thousands of other pikes. It was used in a forest of pikes.
A typical pike weighs about 6 to 8 kilograms. The shaft is usually made of ash wood and is several meters long. One end is either sharpened or capped with an iron spearhead.
The pike is an extremely long weapon. It had different lengths at different times in history, but it was always used by mass formations.
Mike Loades wants first to show just how easy it is to manufacture a pike. Is it really a weapon that anyone can make?
This is so simple. I just took this sapling from the woods outside, and all I have to do is strip off the bark. It's got a natural taper, and it's really very basic work. Most professional armies used a iron pike head.
As the Roman Empire expands, the long wooden spears fade into oblivion. It is not until the Middle Ages that their effect on approaching troops is rediscovered. Scotland, Stirling Bridge. This is where Scottish independence fighters faced the Royal English forces on the 11th of September 1297. Their leader is William Wallace. Hollywood has immortalized him in the movie Braveheart. The Scots are fighting a seemingly hopeless battle against the heavily armed occupying forces. Many of the Scottish warriors are craftsmen, peasants, and small landowners without military skills. Wallace introduces a new combat formation during the Independence Wars, the schiltron. Up to 2,000 warriors form a spiked shield with their pikes, ready to defend themselves from all sides. Attackers hardly stand a chance of breaking through this shield.
As a guerrilla fighter, William Wallace was supreme, but at Stirling Bridge he had to face a massive English army in the field, in pitched battle, and in pitched battle the Scots were the underdogs. They didn't have this full-time trained army, but he had many men who'd flocked to his cause. What he did very quickly was train them to use the pike, the weapon of the common man.
Is it really possible to become a pikeman that fast? Mike Loades conducts an experiment. 15 women and men, complete beginners. Training time, 1 day.
Go, take up your pikes, hold them vertically, and reassemble here. Go!
Usually pikes were only deployed by men on the battlefield. In our experiment, we also include women.
It was very nice, but it looked like you were in a shoe shop selecting which size was going to fit you. Go, I want you to run at the double and get a pike and get back here. Go and put them back for the moment. Come back here and we start again. At the double, collect your pikes, go!
The second round is already better organized.
Well, because of the length of things, very, very unwieldy while you're trying to carry it. So you've got to keep it in both hands and then be aware of where the end is against kind of any other people or the trees, or I guess you wouldn't want to use it inside because of the roof.
When standing, it's very comfortable, but actually getting it up and getting into position is kind of uncomfortable.
It's not something I've ever done before. It's a very long stick, I'm a very small person, and it's a bit unwieldy the first time you pick it up.
The problem with pike training is to use a pike, you need to be very strong and very fit. This is a long, heavy weapon, and holding it up in its proper position is physically very demanding. Most people today would last about 5 minutes with a pike before they collapsed. And then to do that while you're marching across the ground, which is broken or perhaps slippery, is very demanding indeed.
3 paces forward. 1, 2, 3. To your right, turn. Put your pike, Natasha. Lift it up like everybody else. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Then about turn. No! This is right turn.
Yeah.
This is about face. About turn. Yes! You look like a machine. All the cogs are in sync and going the right way. You've got to be in a straight line. You are no longer individuals. You are cogs in my machine. Front rank, charge. Good. Rear rank. Your main job is to bring your spears in between.
The newly fledged pikemen in final formation for the first time.
It's a bit hard, but I feel strong. I'm a short girl, so when I have a 4-meter stick in my hand, it's a bit wobbly, but when you're standing like this, it's actually quite sturdy, so it's good.
So you're the Scottish army waiting patiently at Stirling Bridge. I am the English cavalry about to come bearing down on you.
Was there enough time to memorize all the sequences and movements?
Good job. That is very, very intimidating.
Actually imagining this with thousands of other spear bearers, it must be insane for anybody who will charge this. He must be completely insane.
By the end, when I was running down at them, that was quite intimidating for me because they were working like one single brain, bringing those up together. There was no 1, 2, 3, 4. It was up in one.
Thousands of English soldiers lose their lives at the hands of Scottish pikemen on the 11th of September, 1297. For a brief moment, the dream of independence seems to come true. William Wallace remains a Scottish national hero to this day. The secret of the pike's success is not its revolutionary design, but in the effective drill of a military unit. One single pikeman does not stand a chance. A coordinated wall of pikes, however, is hard to defeat.
Team spirit is important in many jobs, many walks of life, but the difference in the army is it's a difference between life or death. Team will make them do the job more efficient, quicker, and safer. And if they can't rely on their team, they know that that can result in them being killed. So to be able to have trust in your team, to be able to know that you have the team behind you, is absolutely imperative within an army setting.
During the 30 Years' War, 3 centuries after Wallace's victory, entire books on military drills are published. For example, The Art of Infantry Warfare by a German writer detailing movement sequences and formations. Over time, drill and training of soldiers reached new heights. For example, in the Prussian armies. Exercising, standing at attention, shooting for years on end. Thanks to their training, Prussian soldiers rank among the best fighters in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Professional armies use drill to maximize their combat effectiveness. The Prussian goose step is a classic example of a drill. Those are not drills for the battlefield, they're drills to instill the cohesion and the synergy between all of the people in that group. They're all doing these difficult things together. When you ask them to do a simple thing under fire, under stress, on the battlefield, they should be able to do that.
Back to the voluntary test pikemen. Now, Mike Loads will simulate a cavalry attack.
Well, I think you all did extremely well. Now we need to test you against the real thing.
I think just a stick can give you a fair bit of extra security, particularly if you have no idea what you're doing. If you're completely fresh off the farm, it's something between you and the horse.
The formation stays intact.
Well, that's a very intimidating sight. Very, very difficult to get a horse through there. You all feel pretty secure, I'm guessing. Are you? Hey, you all feel pretty safe? Sebastian, you feeling safe? Feeling safe? Yeah, not worried, Nicky? Not worried at all? What's going to happen? Whether they're being attacked by cavalry or by infantry, that pike block is a really devastating military machine.
The pikeman's success also brings about social change. Armies grow larger. Instead of a few mounted knights in armor, countless ordinary soldiers are now decisive for the outcomes of battles. The new armies, however, fight no longer for their lords, but for money. The old feudal order breaks apart. The future belongs to mercenaries and national armies.
Early modern states begin to recruit their own people. They could be mercenaries, they could be natives of the country, but they're recruited directly and they're now owned by the state. That changes things. It means that the recruiting pool is widened and you can recruit from areas where there are no knights.
It is the dawn of the era of mercenaries who go to battle for whoever pays best. If there is no war or their field commander has gone bankrupt, mercenaries often go from country to country, murdering and plundering. The mercenary system also presents new challenges for army commanders. Many of the mercenaries go to war bringing along their wives and children, who also need to be fed. The pikemen from Switzerland have quite the reputation during the 15th century. With halberds, an improved version of the pike, they can be deployed offensively as well. Many rulers enlist the help of their own personal Swiss Guard, and they still provide active service to this day in the Vatican.
The legacy of that is that the Pope still has Swiss guardsmen dressed up in 16th century uniform as his security system. This, on the one hand, is laughable, but on the other hand, it's actually very practical because you can't miss them. They're very obvious, and they do have a halberd, which is quite an unpleasant instrument, even in a blunt one. So the Swiss Guard remind us of an age when mercenary soldiers were a critical part of all armies. And it's only after the rise of nation states and the idea that you actually had a homogeneous national army, which is actually quite a modern idea.
The pike, a long wooden spear with an iron head. 600 years ago, it caused profound changes on the battlegrounds and brought about the downfall of knights. The pike has left its mark. For a long time, it's an integral part of every soldier's equipment. Nevertheless, it quickly becomes superfluous as it's replaced by firearms and bayonets. But long before firearms, another easy-to-operate ranged weapon decides the outcome of entire wars, the crossbow. What technical trick makes it so dangerous? Europe in the early 15th century. The 100 Years' War between France and England is still in full swing. Both sides use the crossbow as a ranged weapon. It turns peasants into warriors in the blink of an eye.
In this case, you've got the opportunistic weapon that is easy, it's available, and pretty much anybody can pick up and use it. Therefore, it creates a situation that if in any fight at any given time, it's a weapon that can be used by everyone.
Puchberg, Austria, is home to a man who knows the secrets of the medieval crossbow like no other. Andreas Bichler builds and explores historical weapons. Together, we want to investigate how the crossbow revolutionized European battlefields 600 years ago, and even knocked experienced knights from their horses.
The craftsmanship of the old classics is just fascinating. Just think about the technical sophistication needed to construct and manufacture such high-tech weapons, especially at that time, at the end of the Middle Ages in the 15th century.
Andreas Bichler works on different crossbow variants based on surviving historical models in his little backyard studio. The basic manufacturing principle is simple. Every crossbow needs a frame called a tiller or stock. Bichler then places a bow onto the stock. This crossbow, a simple model, is made of wood and a waxed yarn string. The crucial detail, however, is the trigger mechanism with what is known as the roller nut. It is typically made of antler.
The nut, this cylindrical pawl, is placed inside a slot within the stock where it can rotate. This was called a lock in the Middle Ages. So how does it work? The trigger bar, the key so to speak, attaches to the nut. There's a cavity in the nut fret, and once you pull it, the roller nut begins to rotate and the bowstring can be released.
This is one of the last steps necessary to finish the crossbow.
By winding the rope around like this, you link the bow tightly with the socket.
Such simple crossbows could already be mass manufactured in the Middle Ages. Weight, about 3 kilograms. Range, up to 300 meters. But they are most effective at a distance of about 80 meters.
They were used from an elevated position to equip and defend wall walks or towers.
Crossbows were already used as weapons of war long before medieval times. The oldest ones come from China. In the 3rd century BCE, Chinese states are in the throes of wars until Qin Shi Huangdi annexes them all and goes down in history as the first emperor of China. In 1974, farmers discover his giant mausoleum with a terracotta army. The realistic true-to-life statues provide important insight into the weaponry of the era. The crossbow is an essential part of the standard equipment of the Imperial Army. It is the first weapon in history to be mass-produced. The elaborate bronze trigger mechanism is cast in standardized molds, which makes it possible to manufacture hundreds of thousands of them and ensure that they are of the exact same quality.
As nations and states get bigger, the armies they deploy get bigger, and the demands they have on their weapons industries expand exponentially. So you're going to have to put a lot of effort not just into the fighting line, but also into the support line. And the attraction of mass-producing weapons is that you can reduce that tail end of the military system. You can produce more weapons with less people. Standardized design, interchangeable parts, these are attractive things when armies get to the size where bespoke handmade weapons are no longer a relevant issue.
The Third Crusade, 1191. A host of Christian knights intends to bring the holy city of Jerusalem under its control. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, is one of the commanders of the crusade. On a military level, he relies mostly on his crossbowmen. They defend the king's armor-clad knights against the troops of Sultan Saladin, who attack with bow and arrow. The crossbow proves superior in close combat. Richard, however, fails to capture Jerusalem. The irony of it all, 10 years later, the legendary English king dies after being hit by a crossbow bolt himself. Back in Austria, together with weapons expert Andreas Bichler and the twins Fabian and David, we set out to find answers. Is it really that easy to learn to fire a crossbow? And does an untrained shooter fire more accurately than with a bow and arrow? The twins have never fired a weapon before. Who will hit the apple on top of the bust?
I don't think I'll hit it. I'm pretty sure I won't hit the apple, maybe the head, but I don't even believe that. Maybe I'll hit the straw around it once.
The first shot misses the target. Using a bow and arrow seems far from easy. The following shots are off target as well.
Missed it again. Yeah, the first one was the best. And from there it just went south. It's much harder to aim with the bow because you don't have a lot of time. You can't just wait until you've found the point of aim. It's very exhausting.
Now the crossbow in comparison.
I've never touched one of these, so I'm a little bit nervous. I don't know what will happen. I would be happy to hit the straw.
Will Fabian aim better?
The direction was good. Next time a little bit lower, but you're aiming well.
Bullseye, after only 3 shots.
Try beating that.
With training, aiming the crossbow gets easier. You can improve. You look for the point of aim. If you find it, you're able to hit the target.
An archer needs a draw weight of up to 75 pounds in order to draw his bow. This is quite challenging for an untrained person. It takes too long and makes it almost impossible to aim well. The crossbow is different. Once it is drawn, the shooters can take as much time as they want before firing it. Over the centuries, the crossbow becomes more refined. The composite structure is a leap forward in terms of efficacy. Composite bows consist of several layers of horn and animal sinew glued together. This technology reaches Europe in the 13th century and renders the already deadly weapon even more perilous. The elaborate manufacturing process helps to exploit the full potential of the different properties and features of the materials.
You can bend horn to some extent, but if you bend it too much, it'll break. This is why you need the layers of sinew. Sinew is very flexible, whereas horn can withstand a lot of pressure and can be compressed. This makes them perfect composite materials for bowyery. It was a really innovative invention. A significant downside, however, is that the manufacturing process is very lengthy. It takes 1 to 2 years. The bow needs to dry completely before it's fully operational.
But the further the crossbow develops, the harder it becomes to draw, until the archer's sheer muscle force alone is no longer sufficient. They now need draw support. Ordinary wooden crossbows don't require an elaborate mechanism. A belt hook is enough.
This is the first mechanical draw support for crossbows, a belt hook. The archer puts in 2 fingers and can then draw the bow with the support of his leg muscles.
Such simple mechanisms are not sufficient for the heavy composite crossbow. A crank can offer relief by drawing the string with a cogwheel mechanism. This can take up to 1 minute per shot.
Another option is using smaller cranks or a kind of pulley. With these I have to draw more, but I need less force to create the tension. This way I can achieve tension that is 5 or 6 times higher than with a manual bow.
But can such a heavy composite crossbow penetrate the mail of a knight? We want to find out, using an exact replica.
I've been firing this weapon for years, but still, I'm running on adrenaline. You can never completely rule out that something will go wrong.
The worst case will be that the string passes over the bolt and seriously hurts the shooter by swinging uncontrollably.
A perfect hit. The rings have been destroyed in several places, and the bolt just went down to the feathers, through the textile armor and, of course, the mail. That means we have an estimated penetration depth of about 20 centimeters, an absolutely deadly shot.
That is not only due to the extremely heavy draw weight of the crossbow, but also to the way the bolt is formed. It is visibly shorter and thicker than the arrow of a regular bow, and has a heavy iron head. The medieval mail coat can no longer protect a knight sufficiently against this weapon.
Crossbow bolt injuries are obviously extremely profound injuries because the bolt is designed to penetrate the skin and flesh as deeply as possible, to go straight through the body and different organs.
Army doctors have an increasingly difficult time treating these terrible battlefield injuries. They haven't acquired comprehensive anatomic knowledge yet, because dissecting human bodies is still forbidden in the Middle Ages for religious reasons. But treating these lesions urgently requires new surgical strategies. Lombard surgeon Roger Frugadi saves injured people thanks to a very special treatment method. If the bolt cannot be removed manually, he fits it into a crossbow again and catapults it out of the flesh. Painful, yet effective.
The surgeons obviously had to intervene on the battlefield, which offered them great insight into the human body. They probably came to understand human anatomy even better than before. They also learnt where extreme caution was needed when removing a foreign object from a man's body. For example, what do I have to watch out for when the object has penetrated a blood vessel? I think all the physicians learned a great deal from these experiences. Their findings have helped modern surgery. I think they really acquired broad knowledge on the battlefield.
Medieval army doctors paved the way for modern surgery. France, the siege of Orléans during the 100 Years' War. 7th of May 1429, Joan of Arc, the legendary peasant girl, leads the French troops to battle. She wants to end the siege of Orléans by the British forces. During the combat, Joan of Arc is wearing armor that does not protect her entire torso. A crossbow bolt hits her in the shoulder, but she survives and leads her soldiers to victory. At the beginning of the 15th century, plate armor becomes increasingly popular as a response to the crossbow. But does it really offer better protection? We want to put it to the test.
Just like medieval tradition has it, the chances are slim. If you don't have the perfect angle, that means positioning the weapon at a 90-degree angle, you barely stand a chance of penetrating plate armor.
Our test shows a steel plate as thick as 3 millimeters provides sufficient protection against crossbow bolts. The medieval arms race enters the next round. For at least 200 years, the crossbow is one of the most pivotal weapons on European battlegrounds. But as plate armor is on the rise in the 15th century, crossbows literally hit a wall. And the emerging fire weapons eventually put an end to the crossbow era. Our third weapon has achieved international notoriety and is dreaded around the world. It has claimed more victims than nuclear bombs, the Kalashnikov. What is the reason for its bloody success? Why is this rifle the go-to weapon of terrorists? Vietnam, 8th of March 1965. US strike forces land in Da Nang. Their purpose: to defeat North Vietnam and prevent the entire country from falling into the hands of the communists. On average, the US soldiers are very young and lack hands-on war experience. But they are excellently equipped, for example with the new and modern assault rifle M16. The North Vietnamese soldiers use Soviet weapons, primarily the AK-47, a Kalashnikov.
The Kalashnikov 47 of 1947 is a Soviet interpretation of the Second World War assault rifle developed by the Germans and to an extent by the Soviets. It is the most all-round useful piece of hardware of that type ever built.
The history of the AK-47 begins in World War II. Russian soldier Mikhail Kalashnikov is seriously injured. After his recovery, he decides to become an arms designer. It is only after the war in 1947 that he finishes the prototype of the fully automatic assault rifle, hence the name AK-47. In 1949, it becomes the standard weapon of the Russian army. Millions of Kalashnikovs are manufactured. What is it that makes the Kalashnikov a weapon that almost anyone, even untrained individuals, can use to kill? Stephen Bull is a writer and military weapons expert. He takes a closer look at these questions for us. The Kalashnikov consists of around 100 parts, is 90 centimeters long, and weighs just under 4.5 kilograms when loaded.
The AK-47 was a revolutionary weapon.
The Kalashnikov is a gas-operated rifle.
When you pull the trigger, an explosion takes place and air expands as a result. The explosion causes gas pressure to rise, and part of this is used to reload. The pressure is redirected into the mechanical system, which ejects the old cartridge and reloads a new one.
The reliability of a weapon is a crucial factor for the outcome of a war. US soldiers in Vietnam soon noticed that their modern M16 does not work well in the swampy forests where humidity is high. The troops of the superpower constantly struggle with jamming and malfunctions. Their opponent's weapon, however, is surprisingly robust. We want to find out if the stories are true. How big is the difference between M16 and Kalashnikov?
You have to bear in mind that in a modern war, we're taking cover, going into shell holes, staying low to the ground. Sometimes these are the sort of conditions that a soldier and his weapon will have to put up with. And mud baths like this do form part of modern testing of weapons.
The M16, the American standard rifle in Vietnam, is tested first.
Now, a magazine, and we're ready to go.
The M16 is submerged for 30 seconds.
And I think we're ready to bring it out.
We create jungle-like conditions for firing the weapon.
That is filthy.
On a shooting stand, we draw a direct comparison. Will large amounts of dirt affect the functionality of the weapon? The test team is forced to leave the shooting stand for safety reasons. Their weapon could blow up in their faces. Using a rope, they are able to pull the trigger of the M16.
Ready?
Fire hole.
So here it is. Let's take the magazine off. It's off. So the magazine is now empty. I'll work the mechanism. Oh, it's quite tough. I can hardly move the thing. Nothing. I can't actually work the mechanism. So this gun would just shoot once and then stop. So this could be a problem for the soldier on the battlefield, and this certainly was the case for the Americans in Vietnam.
Now we'll test the AK-47 that is said to be more reliable. Is it better suited for fighting in adverse and muddy conditions?
Target down the far end. We're behind the metal doors. Are we ready to go?
Mm-hmm. Fire in a hole.
Yes. Wow.
Yes.
2.
The rope is gone. But the result is good.
Yeah.
In our test, the AK-47 can fire several shots.
Okay, everything is working.
Right. So the first 2 bullets have fired correctly, and the 3rd bullet was left in the gun. The only reason for this was that the rope failed, so that the gun would continue to fire perfectly. So the AK-47 has actually passed this horrible test with flying colours.
The reason for this is the way it is built. Intended clearances inside the weapon allow it to withstand exposure to large amounts of dirt. The American assault rifle, the M16, lacks such spaces. The GIs in the Vietnam War have to clean their weapons constantly. Even the slightest amount of debris can disrupt the loading process. Our next experiment, we want to see if it really is that easy to operate a Kalashnikov. We're in the US. Arizona's gun regulations are so lax that we can test the AK-47 even in full automatic mode.
I'm going to teach you how to take apart this gun. There's basically 4 parts you got to remember.
Our test participant, Vivian, has never touched an automatic firearm in her life. Weapons expert Kenton Tucker disassembles it in front of her. Afterwards, Vivian is meant to reassemble the AK-47.
Now I have to put it back together.
Now you have to put it back together.
Okay.
Vivian only has to put back 4 components. First the bolt and the gas piston. Then the carrier spring. And the last piece is the cover. Vivian is successful on her first go.
There you go.
Oh!
Got it. Was that hard?
No, but dirty.
Oh, that was your first time.
Yeah.
Now imagine if you did it about 20 more times, you'd have it down pretty well.
You can't really imagine that this is a weapon of war because it's just so dangerous and so easy to take apart at the same time. Anyone can use it.
A firearm needs to be reliable, easy to operate, and accurate. These are the decisive factors. Together with Kenton Tucker, we want to compare the AK-47 directly to its rival, the American M16. The target, cardboard stand-ups at a distance of 15 meters. The standard magazine capacity of both weapons is 30 rounds, gone in no time at full automatic fire. Which model will be more accurate?
Well, all 30 rounds went into the target, but you'll notice that it's pretty well dispersed. The AK moves around a lot on fully automatic fire. That's 15 meters away. It's okay. Actually, it was kind of hard to control, but it did the job. Well, this is all 30 rounds through an M16. As you can tell, they're grouped tighter. It was easier to control. It's more precise of a weapon on fully automatic fire. You're all over the place with an AK-47 on fully automatic fire. M16, it's right where you want it to be.
Since the Kalashnikov works with excess energy, there is more recoil compared to the M16. The fact that it's easy to use and very reliable comes at a price: limited accuracy. Now it's Vivian's turn to fire the Kalashnikov. How will she, without any training, handle it?
You're light, I'm light. You know, we're not that big. So what you do is you really get your body in front of it.
In front?
In front of it, because it'll push you back.
Okay.
And you try to hold down on that gun, because it's going to rise up. Just shooting, 12 rounds a second or so. Okay, here you go. All right, you can shoot at it at will. What'd you think?
Well, I'm probably gonna get bruises or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I'm shaking.
You're shaking? Okay. Yeah. All right. That's the first time you've ever done that, too.
Yeah. And I close my eyes.
This is a violent gun to shoot on full auto.
Okay.
And you just proved that point.
A weapon that's easy to operate. The reason why it's still frequently used in civil wars and in terror attacks.
It's everywhere. It's the easiest thing to move because there are so many of them. It's cheap. It's unbelievably cheap. And if you want a Kalashnikov, wherever you are, it's almost certain you can get one.
Guerrilla fighters and terrorists like to show themselves with Kalashnikovs. In January 2001, Osama bin Laden can be seen smiling while testing a new model. The Lebanese Hezbollah militia has immortalized it on its flag, just like the African state of Mozambique, where many still remember the bloodshed of the civil war in the 1970s and 80s.
So they turn up in every country on the planet in the hands of the wrong people. They've been the icon of freedom fighters, guerrillas, and terrorists for 50 years. It's just not possible to imagine a world without Kalashnikovs. You know, they are as ubiquitous as flies.
The Pakistani town of Dara Adam Khel, close to the Afghan border, is a center for illegal arms trade, where a perfect replica of a Kalashnikov is cheaper than a smartphone. The counterfeit costs less than $100 US. In Africa, for example in South Sudan, children use Kalashnikovs with catastrophic consequences.
The use of child soldiers is fundamentally abuse. Children are not programmed to commit such acts of violence. When you give them something like the Kalashnikov, which is a symbol of something so powerful, such a dangerous weapon, depending on the level that the child is at, how long they've been recruited as a soldier, the training that they've been through, it may give them a sense of power, but ultimately, for the majority of children, it will terrify them.
Reliable, cheap, and easy to operate. The features that made the Kalashnikov the deadliest weapon in the world. Every year, 80,000 people die from AK-47s and their successors. 100 million of these weapons are still circulating. There are no foreseeable ways of reducing the number of weapons. Manufacturers from all industrial nations want to make money in the weapons industry. Bans on exports or raids don't make a difference. Even less so with there being countless illegal replicas of Kalashnikovs. Here, the Turkish police confiscated 120,000 cartridges and dozens of AK-47s from Kurdish rebels. Mikhail Kalashnikov is to this day revered as a national hero in Russia. They even built a memorial for him. Up to his death on the 3rd of December 2013, he liked to give interviews.
Ultimately, it's the Germans' fault that the Kalashnikov exists. If they hadn't started the war, I might have built machines for agricultural purposes.
Almost anyone can buy weapons in almost any place in the world. It's especially easy in conflict areas or in the United States. In the future, it could become even less complicated, with weapons made in a 3D printer. Since humans began fighting against one another, speed has been the deciding factor between life and death. With complex experiments, we want to determine how this affected the development of weapons technology and changed the course of history. The Revolver has a rotating cylinder to increase firing speed.
I'll gladly take 6 shots, 5 shots, 4 shots over someone who only has 1.
The Sling projectiles can be almost as dangerous as modern firearms.
Whether you're wearing armor or not, if it hits you in the head, it's certainly going to kill you.
With the revolutionary Chariot, death by bow and arrow can happen at lightning speed.
A game-changing weapon. It brought mobility to the battlefield.
Our first weapon, the Chariot, designed to bring warriors quickly to the enemy, while at the same time protecting them from attacks with its speed. In the 17th century BC on the Nile Delta, the hooves of thousands of horses shake the ground as the Hyksos people attack with their chariots. For the Egyptians, the vehicle is a completely new weapon system, and it takes quite a bit of practice to master.
The skill sets required on board involved archery, javelin work, and doing all of this from a relatively fast-moving and awkward platform. So this is a skill set involving keeping your balance, using weapons in a new and difficult environment.
The Hyksos come from the Near East, bringing the technology of the chariot with them. It mobilizes their warriors to give them a decisive advantage over the Pharaoh's army. For the first time in its 1,500-year history, Egypt is occupied by foreign rule. The Hyksos continue their rule of the country for another century. Weapons expert Mike Loades wants to reveal the secret to the chariot's success. How is it constructed? And what makes it effective on the battlefield?
The primary function is for the archer. So he has a driver, but the main warrior is the archer. All of this, the horses, the wheels, the chariot, all it's for is to put an archer on the battlefield.
A weapons system faster and more mobile than ever seen before in the ancient world. Made of light wood and leather. It was most commonly used by warriors with bows and arrows, but spearmen and axe fighters also used chariots.
When chariots first came thundering onto the ancient battlefield, warfare changed. Now, for the first time, squadrons of chariots could come streaming in for surprise attack. Chariots could control the battlefield, they could frustrate enemy troop movements, they could respond instantly to changing situations. They had mobility. This was a new tactic in the general's toolkit, and with it came a new type of warrior, the cavalryman. He was elite, he was expensive, and above all else, he was heroic.
This technological revolution in warfare would have never been possible without one of mankind's greatest inventions, the wheel. The first known wheel dates back to more than 5,000 years ago. It was discovered in Slovenia in 2002. Made of ash and oak wood, this disc wheel and its wagon were most likely used for agriculture. An artifact from Poland shows the oldest depiction of a wheel. The Brno-Chica vase dates back to around 3,500 BC.
The wheel is unbelievably important for mankind. At first, it wasn't really designed for speed. Large solid wood disc wheels just wouldn't give you too much speed. But you could use them to efficiently transport loads with a cart, using, for example, a team of oxen. And that was absolutely a relief in workload for the Neolithic population.
The first evidence pointing to the use of wheels in war can be found on the Ur standard, which dates back to 3000 BC. The wooden box, which comes from a royal tomb in present-day Iraq, shows pictures of peace on one side and pictures of war on the other. On the chariot, disc wheels are recognizable, most likely a representation of a Sumerian military victory.
The original Sumerian chariots are essentially four-wheel carts. They're powered by asses. These are not fast vehicles. They're not dynamic. They're just mobile platforms from which men can fight. Spears, maybe bows and arrows. They're not fast. They don't change the pace of battle. They probably enable men to arrive at battle fresher than they would have done if they'd marched there or run there. So they have some advantages, but they're not fundamentally transformational weapons.
Another invention is necessary: spokes. Initially, wheels are equipped with 4 spokes, which doesn't exactly make them stable.
And then a big innovation was to just use more spokes so that you could distribute the load better and you could put more weight onto the axle.
A 4-spoked wheel is light enough to be used on the battlefield, but with a heavy load, it can quickly break. The first solution, twice as many spokes, but this also increases weight at the expense of speed. The brilliant compromise, 6 spokes, providing optimal stability and maneuverability. While still under the Hyksos occupation, the Egyptians begin improving their chariot technology. They experiment with different materials and designs until they find the most efficient solution.
What the Egyptians did was they got pieces of timber like this, so that each spoke is actually 2 pieces. But the bend goes into the next spoke. So this is that spoke, and it comes onto this one here. So this joint is now incredibly strong because it was grown. They would take young trees and at a young age bend them over. Here is the joint. That is now as strong as you can get it, and it's quick to assemble.
In the 1920s, in the Valley of the Kings, scientists make a spectacular discovery. Tutankhamun's tomb reveals, among other things, 6 perfectly preserved chariots. Even after the end of foreign rule, the Egyptians continued to use Hyksos technology. No one knows whether the chariot played a role in shifting the balance of power. In a workshop, restorers have spent several weeks building an Egyptian chariot for us, based on the highly sophisticated royal carriage of Tutankhamun.
Designing these chariots really was a science in its own right. People spent 200 or more years developing the technology. They understood that it depended on the material. I couldn't use wood that was too heavy, or else I wouldn't be able to transport it very well. And I potentially needed individual parts that I was able to replace, which made the entire vehicle more flexible. And in doing so, I'd have the advantage in combat.
With individual parts, it comes down to what weighs the least and what is the most useful for battle.
They also considered the issue of suspension so that the shooter could remain as stable as possible, and if you drove over a hole, you wouldn't miss completely. So they came up with strategies like a leather platform for the archer to stand on. They really thought a lot about the individual parts, which is fascinating technological work.
A woven leather platform for a chariot needs to be extremely sturdy in order to carry a crew of up to 3 men. On the other hand, it needs to be flexible enough to cushion them from any impact from the ground along the way. The finished chariot, built from natural materials according to historical models. Leather straps hold the wooden poles together from the yoke in front of the horses all the way to the axle at the rear of the carriage.
You can see the axle runs at the rear of the platform. So all the weight is on the wheels, it's not on the horses. And these wheels are independent. They are on a fixed axle, and the wheels move independently on the axle.
The Battle of Kadesh, 1274 BC. The Egyptians battle against the Hittites, their new rivals for domination of the Near East. Both sides have the same weapons at their disposal. According to ancient sources, over 5,000 chariots face off as the 2 great powers of antiquity clash on the battlefield.
The Egyptians and the Hittites were involved in a very serious arms race with the new chariot technology. And the chariots are used to engage the enemy and engage each other. And essentially it's a battle about chariots, and that's certainly how the Egyptians represent their version, in which they win, and the Hittites had a version in which, of course, they won as well. It's one of history's greatest drawn battles.
The Hittites' chariots are heavier and less agile than the Egyptians, which is also a result of their larger 3-man crews, and thus the Egyptians win at least the race for speed. We want to put the Egyptian chariot to the test on a race course to take a look at its driving performance. Today, one factor plays a crucial role, as it did long ago: the horses.
Men drove chariots for about 1,000 years before they rode horses. And that's because early horses were really quite small. They weren't big enough and strong enough to carry a man's weight. But you could pull a man by putting him in a wheeled vehicle.
Our well-trained racehorses are 1.6 meters tall. Egyptian horses were about 30 centimeters smaller. But they had a special trick.
You'll see they've got this neck fork here. This is quite different to modern harness. The horses are just attached just by the withers there. Only one attachment with a yoke joining them. So with this system, it's much more challenging to drive them and to keep them straight. It takes a lot more driving expertise. But on the battlefield, it was more efficient. If one of your horses got shot, then you could change the team very quickly, like a Formula One pit crew. Men would rush in, 1-2 straps, you can take the team out and get another team in really quickly.
How fast can this kind of chariot go on a flat surface? The first test for our replica is a distance of 50 meters.
So what time did we get?
6.50.
That's not bad. 6 seconds, 50 meters. That's it. That's it. 12 seconds for 100 meters.
With 2 horses, Mike Loads manages a speed of 30 kilometers per hour. An impressive speed for ancient times. But it wasn't possible everywhere.
Man muss sich das so vorstellen, dass natürlich so ein Streitwagen...
You have to imagine that in ancient times, of course, they needed to plan a chariot operation. And that meant their choice battlefield depended on where they could most effectively use their chariots. We know that the Egyptians specifically sent out cleanup crews to collect stones so that nothing would trip up the vehicles, and then they could drive right up to the enemy and take full advantage of their speed and efficiency.
The most important requirement to have the swiftest chariot, after the spoke wheel, domesticated horses. They are animals with stamina, agile, fast, and they can be trained, ideal for warfare.
The horse is the single most important animal of war. It's carried men to war, it's carried men in battle, and it's carried them out of battle again. It's critical to the logistics of war, to the moving of heavy equipment, artillery, for example. Horses are a creature that has been selectively bred over thousands of years to serve man's military needs.
The importance of horse breeding more than 3,000 years ago is demonstrated by a document known as the Kikuli text, written by Hittite in the 14th century BC.
Wenn man sich die Kikuli-Texte anschaut...
When you look at the Kikuli text, if you know anything about horses, you notice immediately that a team is trained to optimal performance as fast as possible. There are different training sessions. There are instructions about feeding, only oats, then only alfalfa. And then they were taken on night rides, which was probably also so that enemy spies couldn't figure out when you had your chariot teams ready to run, when they're ready for action. That needed to be kept secret for as long as possible.
A lot of effort is needed to get the best out of the horses. But the archer also needs a chariot driver that he can rely on. For our second test, we bring in backup.
So now I have a driver and I am the archer. This was the main 2-man crew in battle. You had the driver and the warrior who was the archer. What we see on the Egyptian chariots is on both sides crossed quivers. So the presumption is that I can shoot here and turn around and use these arrows to shoot on that side and change, and that I can get over and shoot using these arrows on this side and turn and use those. That I should be able to shoot from all 4 corners of the chariot, because in a battle, especially chariot to chariot battle, you don't know where the chariot is coming out of the dust cloud, so you need to be able to move around.
How well can Mike Loads aim at full speed? From a narrow chariot, archers need to be able to shoot in all directions. The chariot suspension should make sure that Mike can keep his balance. Nine out of 12 shots hit their target.
So I had a few misses, but you know, if you were in battle, for everyone you missed, there's a man standing behind, so it would have hit somebody in dense ranks of men. It's fine to shoot from this platform. If you imagine thousands of chariots on the battlefield, which there were, then the dust clouds, you wouldn't be able to see where they were. They're moving and you can't see where they are. That's fast enough not to be shot back at. So I think, for its time, it was a really useful weapon and a game-changing weapon. It brought mobility to the battlefield.
But there are also drawbacks. A highly trained chariot unit is extremely expensive and can only be used on the plains and not in the forest or the mountains. As the horse gains popularity, cavalrymen replace the chariot. Our next weapon. For centuries, it decides the victors of ancient battles. And yet today, it is associated almost exclusively with a story from the Bible, the sling. "2,000 years ago in Greek, Roman and other armies, slingers are in high demand. Yet only a few pieces of evidence has been handed down about this simple range weapon. Dating back to the 2nd century AD, this relief on Trajan's column depicts Iberians using slings, an indication of their great importance during the era of the Roman Empire.
In ancient battles, the use of the sling was quite common, and the sling was used in much the same way as muskets and rifles in early 18th century, 19th century warfare.
Our expert, Mike Loades, is headed to Denmark. In a historic village, he wants to discover the secret of this almost forgotten ancient superweapon.
The sling is possibly the earliest weapon that gave man mechanical advantage. What it did was it extended the length of his arm. It made them longer levers, so you could throw with more speed and more force.
During the Stone Age, slings are used for hunting, and later their specific snapping sound can be heard on the battlefield. An ancient sling is between 60 to 100 centimeters long and made up of braided plant fibers. Its projectiles weigh between 30 to 250 grams. These stones, located in modern-day Turkey, are some of the earliest evidence of the sling. They date back to around 8,500 years ago.
In expert hands, the sling's a really powerful weapon. It was a breaker of heads and a smasher of bones. And the best slingers came from the Balearic Isles. They were sought after by all the ancient armies, the Greeks, the Romans, the Carthaginians. Legend has it that the mothers of children in the Balearic Isles would not let them eat, would not give them their food until they could hit it with a sling. There is such a cultural tradition there, and it lasts today. Even today, the best slingers come from the Balearics.
Talented slingers are celebrated stars in the Balearic Islands. On Mallorca, in Sao Paulo, the Slinging World Championship takes place every year. Not surprisingly, the best slinger in the world is also from the Balearic Islands. Luis Pons Livermore is a multiple-time champion and will support us with our experiments.
You have different parts, the ring where you put the finger, the pouch where you put the stone or whatever, and the final it is the tail that have two functions. One is the crack, make a noise.
Like a whiplash?
Yeah, like a whip. And the other one, forget precision.
But if this snaps like a whip, that means this is going incredibly fast. I mean, this is a high-speed weapon, isn't it? I mean, you can throw a rock, But when you throw it with this, then it becomes a bullet.
An important factor for speed is known as the band. The longer it is, the faster the projectile will launch. The part in the middle is known as the pouch.
You're making the divide here, which is this part of the sling, which is critical.
Yep. Let's have these two parts exactly the same.
The world champion slinger knows exactly how to make the weapon himself. The plant fibers are extremely resistant to tearing.
How old were you when you made your first sling?
Probably 10 years old.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Began 10, 11.
You would never throw with someone else's sling. There's a pride in making your own sling.
No, all the slings are different.
With practiced movements, Lewis finishes his sling in less than 30 minutes.
That's fantastic. That was so quick. It seems so easy, but it's elaborate.
During ancient wars, slingers are used in a variety of ways. In Caesar's time, a typical Roman battle formation is made up of heavily armed legionnaires arranged into blocks on the battlefield. Each block, known as a cohort, consists of close to 500 soldiers. Those with slings are placed in between the individual blocks, as well as in the front rows.
And once the battle starts, you could have the elite slingers, like the Balearic slingers, you could have them in the front line, men who can aim accurately, men who could target a general on a horse at 300 meters. But you could also use regular slingers behind ranks of archers, because the sling has got a greater range than the bow and arrow. And these men would be throwing high in the air, bringing down a tempest of stones falling on the heads of the enemy.
In addition to the Balearic snipers, less well-trained men with slings also play a key role. But how difficult is it to master the weapon? We want to find out in an experiment with 3 amateurs. For safety reasons, tennis balls will be used instead of stones.
The ring goes in the middle finger. You put it like this, and it's hanging out of your hand, okay? You pick the tail, and you close it in your hand like this, okay, soft. And you see the pouch, you have to be the same level, all right? When you have this, you have to put the tennis ball just on top. Once you get the body position and you have the sling in your hand, you spin it 3-4 times. You have to pull your arm, and when you pull your arm, you have to get close the tail. So having a sling is like having a long arm. For example, if you're going to pass the ball like this and it's going to go out, it's the same. You have to get the movement to pull it front and open your hand forward.
Their target, a tin can 10 meters away. Who scores on their first try? For world champion Lewis, it's a piece of cake.
No pressure.
No pressure.
The amateurs have a hard time with their slings. Accurate shots are a rare exception.
It's harder than I thought, because my balls were all over the place. So, I don't know. In 10 years, I might be as good as him.
Even in ancient times, years of training are what distinguishes the snipers from just another soldier with a sling.
There's a lot of debate around how long it takes to become an expert in something, and there's figures around from 20 hours up until 10,000 hours. But what we do know simply is that the more you practice something, the better you become at it, even if you're not naturally good at something.
A sling is simple to make and can be mastered through training, making it the weapon of ordinary people. A message that can also be found in the Old Testament. In the famous story of David and Goliath, a small Israeli boy faces a massive Philistine warrior. The young shepherd reaches into his satchel, takes out a stone, and slings it to hit the giant in the forehead.
This tells us everything about the sling. It's a leveling weapon. It allows somebody who is not of elite status, doesn't have all the elite equipment of armor, sword and horse, to do something really significant on the battlefield.
Even today, the sling can still be highly symbolic. such as when Palestinians stand up to Israeli soldiers with slings. David versus Goliath, an age-old tradition of the Holy Land.
So it's almost like a, despite what you've got, we are stronger than you. We have got more resilience than you. And that weapon almost symbolizes that resilience.
Long ago, and today as well, mainly stones are used as ammunition, available anywhere. But not every stone is suitable.
But they have to be a uniform shape. It's no good me picking up these stones.
No, nothing.
Because they will throw all over the place.
All over the place, they will not go in a straight line. Maybe you can lose it when you go spinning.
So you have to either find stones that are a nice, even shape, or you have to...
Make them.
Make them.
This kind of prepared stone projectile weighs about 200 grams. What kind of impact does it have? 15 meters away, a wooden and tin target is set up for a test. The sling's characteristic whip crack noise is heard every time that the back part of the sling breaks the sound barrier during the shot. The sound wave of the sling band gets faster and faster as it continues to the slack end, where it reaches twice the speed of sound.
You've just eaten that stone after stone, just eating away. And you were doing it over and over again. It's a very rhythmic action.
Yeah, if you have the point, you have to keep shooting at the same time.
Look at the impact on the metal. I mean, it's a terrifying weapon. Terrifying weapon. I mean, those stones, I mean, that's going to kill you. That speed that you're throwing with that whip crack force, whether you're wearing armor or not, that's if it hits you in the head, it's certainly going to kill you.
Yeah, obviously.
How fast does the stone projectile travel when it's shot by our champion Luis? We test the speed with a high-precision digital meter. But in order for a measurement to be made, Luis needs to shoot directly through the opening. Success, but what speed did the stone reach?
52 meters per second. So that's 186, 187 kilometers per hour. Pretty fast.
A sling can accomplish top speeds, but precise aim is difficult, especially in combat.
Ancient slings weren't precision instruments, partly because of the material they were made from. The smallest change of angle would cause an extreme change to your trajectory.
A delay of just 0.2 of a second before release can result in a deviation of 30 degrees in the projectile's trajectory. To increase their hit rate, ancient warriors choose projectiles that are as uniform as possible. These kind of standardized lead projectiles were produced more than 2,000 years ago.
So we've got two very different missiles here. We've got, the heavy rock and the Roman glandis, which is Latin for acorn, and you can see that's an acorn shape.
Lead projectiles, known as glanders by the Romans, can be produced at any campfire, since lead melts at a temperature of 328 degrees centigrade. The lead projectiles often also contain a message as a kind of sarcastic note to the enemy. On this one it says in Greek letters, "Take that." The tradition of writing on projectiles continues to this day. During World War II, Allied aircraft crews decorate their bombs with greetings to the Germans. In two wars against Iraq, Americans addressed their bombs to Saddam Hussein.
Them taking some small psychological step to give them a message they're probably not going to necessarily see that message, but it gives that person a sense of being able to demonstrate the anger they feel inside, the emotion that they've got inside, what they want to say to that person. So by putting it on the weapon, it almost makes them feel a little bit of satisfaction.
In war, it can also help to personalize your weapon by giving it a name.
Deshalb hat man immer wieder der Waffe ein...
That's why people used to name their weapons and sent some sort of greeting along with them. Swords are supposed to be magical, and when they named their swords Iron Eater or Long and Sharp, I suppose the name alone meant to say it all.
Sicherlich auch Programm gewesen.
In the ancient world and during the Middle Ages, swords take on mythical qualities. In modern times, soldiers often feel that they have a special relationship with their firearms, which they show by taking extra care of them. Behind this desire, there is a need to preserve something personal in the midst of what can often seem to be an inhuman war. A miracle weapon may also be called upon for extra help when it comes to matters of life or death. Our next experiment tests the effect of a sling on a hypothetical enemy. World champion Lewis slings stones at a realistic leather skin dummy block. Our camera records the moment of impact.
Look at that, and we could see how hard it hit by how far it has bounced back. Here it is. I mean, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 6 meters from where it hit. So that was a tremendous impact, and you hit him right over the heart. That would have smashed his ribs and stopped his heart.
Yeah.
Next up, we try the lead-cast glanders. How well can the smaller sharp-edged projectiles penetrate the dummy?
Look at this, Lewis. That is chilling. It's actually in there. You actually got it inside the man. This has gone through and embedded deep inside. That is a weapon.
Slingers appear again and again in world history. In this 14th century depiction from the Middle Ages, they are shown next to archers. During their conquest of the Incan Empire, Spain is confronted with warriors bearing slings. The sling is finally replaced almost everywhere with the emergence of firearms. Starting in the 16th century, they completely changed the nature of warfare. Small handguns are used in combat, in addition to muskets and later rifles. The revolver is legendary, not only because of its speed. Its myth is closely tied to a romanticized ideal of the Wild West. Cowboys, outlaws, and sheriffs. They all have the revolver in their holsters, and whoever draws faster wins. But fewer know that the revolver also influenced military conflicts, such as the American Civil War. Since one of its design details gives it the advantage in speed.
The history of war is a constant search for an advantage. Having weapons that are faster than the enemy's weapons is a great advantage. If you can shoot faster, you can kill him quicker than he can kill you.
Dreams of a pistol that can fire more than one shot in a row have been around for quite some time. But designs are either too expensive or, like these pepperbox models, too heavy. Until a young American enters the ring with big ideas and no shortage of entrepreneurial spirit.
Samuel Colt is a classic American entrepreneur. He's a showman. He delights in public display, in doing something exceptional. He first came to public attention by blowing up a ship. Everybody got very wet and nobody bought the torpedo.
Supposedly, Colt comes up with the idea for the revolver's mechanism while on a ship. Legend has it that at an age of just 16, depending on the version of the tale, he notices either the helm or a specific maneuver. When the anchor is hoisted, a winch clamps after each rotation. This basic principle is later the inspiration for the revolver magazine.
He then comes up with the idea of the revolving six-chambered pistol, which becomes his trademark.
The first revolver that Colt sells to the Army on a large scale is the Colt Walker, produced in 1847 for the Mexican-American War. John Rivera is a former policeman and professional weapons expert who has won several rapid-fire competitions. At a shooting range with John, we want to discover the secret of the Colt. The Colt Walker, weight just under 2 kilos, caliber .44, meaning roughly an 11mm diameter.
Samuel Colt is the godfather of firearms.
From 1861 to 1865, in the American Civil War, the states of the Union battle against the Confederates of the South. The North wants to abolish slavery, and the South wants to keep things the way they are. More than 3 million soldiers fight their own countrymen. Ultimately, an estimated 750,000 of them are killed. The high death toll is a consequence of the use of modern weapons. Colt sells close to 400,000 revolvers to the Union alone. And many of the firearms he sells are Colt Walkers. How fast could Civil War soldiers shoot with it?
In the olden days, what they would do is they would have a deer horn or something similar to this, and they'd put their finger over the top, and they would turn it upside down. They'd get measuring, and they would pour directly into the cylinder and drop in a 44-grain round projectile in it.
The Colt Walker, though, still needs to be loaded from the front.
I'm going to center on the ball, and I'm going to push it down and seat it. It came to complete rest, and now I know that it's actually seated in the bottom of the cylinder. So imagine the difficulty if you're riding or in combat and somebody's shooting at you right now as you're trying to manipulate and load your gun.
We want to test how quickly 6 shots can be fired with the Colt Walker.
This is considered cavalry style with the butts forward, because if you're riding a horse and you need to get out your firearm, it's easier to cross-draw and come up to your target than it is because the barrel is so long, coming all the way up your side and coming onto target. It's pull out across the body, up, hammer back, acquire the target, fire. See the caps falling out? Acquire target.
After every shot, John Rivera needs to raise the weapon up to a vertical position so that the detonators fall out. With this early version, known as a single-action revolver, the shooter has to manually cock the gun every time. This rotates the barrel and locks it into correct position for the next shot. The complex mechanism is prone to errors.
We had a misfire on this one, so I only got 4 shots off on target. And this one is a prime example of what happens if you don't raise the gun and clear it. What happened is it's fragmented, and if I continue and if I didn't raise it up and shake it, watch, it'll jam down below, and now my gun is no longer good.
John Rivera needs a total of 15 seconds to fire 4 shots. The reloading process would cost him over another minute. Nevertheless, the weapon still provides an advantage for soldiers in combat.
It is ridiculously heavy, and if you're holding it out, you're going to be shaking, and if you're riding a horse, it's going to be hard to acquire a target and stay on it. It was state-of-the-art at the time. I mean, I'll gladly take 6 shots, 5 shots, 4 shots over someone who only has 1 any day of the week.
The revolver is known as a side weapon by the military, a last resort for cases of close combat. It can be easily beat by a rifle in terms of range and precision, but it still was fired countless times on Civil War battlefields.
So Samuel Colt sold the firearm to both the Confederate and to the Union. And although it was the same weapon, it was used differently. The Confederate, smaller, not quite as funded, were guerrilla warfare. So what they would do is they would sneak in through the trees, through the bushes, and it was easy to carry a pistol, whereas a long rifle would get caught on shrubs as you went through or trees. Whereas the Union, this was a cavalry gun. They would carry it cross-draw, quick, agile. They could get up on to the Confederate quickly and come up on the target and shoot.
Samuel Colt continues to develop his weapon and puts a popular idea of the era into practice. Mass production using standardized, interchangeable parts.
Auf der Weltausstellung in London 1851.
At the 1851 World's Fair in London, Samuel Colt takes 10 of his guns apart and mixes them up on a table. He then puts them back together and proves that every weapon is operational. They all work and can shoot. This demonstrated the extent that their production had already been standardized, so that the parts were all individually interchangeable. And at the time, that was a new thing for weapons systems.
With his revolver models, Colt continues to build upon his legend. The 1851 Navy is his most successful model, selling 250,000 units. Many consider his 1860 Army model to be the best of the early revolvers. And finally, his single-action Army 1873 is the first revolver that can be loaded with copper cartridges, allowing for even more speed.
By introducing the cartridge, you could carry multiple rounds in your pocket. You can carry them on your belt. You see the old cowboy movies with the loops in the back. You could load and come up on your target faster, and in doing so, get off your shots. Versus the old one, remember we had to do the cap and ball and make sure the cap would fall out. And if you became proficient with your firearm, you can actually come up and with your opposite hand, get off 6 shots.
The ultimate legend of the Wild West. An outlaw and a sheriff face off in a duel. They both pull quickly to shoot from the hip. Realistic or just a Hollywood fantasy? Sports gunman John Rivera demonstrates this kind of targeted hip shot. It takes a lot of training to be actually able to aim.
So if you notice, I never brought the gun up higher than my hip, okay? So motion is time. If I'm taking the gun and coming all the way up and coming on target versus a gunfighter who practices enough and can hit from this, it's not a fair fight.
How fast can he shoot with a revolver? John Rivera uses a modern weapon optimized for competition.
Here we go.
We time him for 6 shots. A slow motion replay shows that with a fluid movement of both hands, John can fire shot after shot in seconds.
That's how it's done. So basically all those shots were right about within just over 1.5 seconds. I would say that's pretty fast. I would hate to be downrange.
In direct comparison to the Colt Walker, in the time it takes John to fire just 1 shot with a Colt Walker, he can manage 6 with a newer Colt model. In the United States, speed and trick shooting has turned into a competitive sport. The main event is fast draw, judging who pulls their gun the quickest to fire 1 or more shots. And it's entertaining for the fans as well. The revolver's legendary status began in the middle of the 19th century with Samuel Colt's early models.
What we've got with Samuel Colt is somebody who sees an opportunity to create something more than a product. He's creating, well, I don't think a revolver is a lifestyle, but it's certainly, it's that kind of designer-branded good.
But an obsession with these kinds of firearms also kills around 15,000 people per year in the United States. From a numerical standpoint, there is almost one gun for each of the country's inhabitants, the highest density in the world. And the National Rifle Association, NRA for short, is also to thank.
In today's controversial discussions about the NRA, it's important not to forget that the organization was originally founded in 1871 to teach civilians about the safe use of firearms.
Since the 1970s, the NRA has played a major role in US politics. Their most important priority, preventing stricter laws on firearms, even if bloody tragedies have become a part of everyday life.
What we're looking at is a country where the gun is part of culture and identity in a way that it isn't in older countries. And the National Rifle Association has demonstrated that there is an enormous political support for retaining the right to keep and bear whatever weapons you like to have. These can be military-grade assault rifles, hunting rifles, all kinds of weapons. The Americans are essentially in love with weapons.
Mass shooting in schools steadily start new debates about stricter laws on firearms. Some states have changed their laws, but the number of acts of violence has not decreased. Samuel Colt's invention of the revolver also contributes to the United States' current issues with gun control. By the 20th century, the military replaces the revolver with semi-automatic self-loading pistols. Today, it is primarily popular with collectors and marksmen. Speed is still a decisive factor for armies. How fast will weapons of the future be? Have we already reached the limits of what is possible? When it comes to developing destructive weapons, the innovativeness of mankind seems to know no limits. Our international experts reveal the secrets of weapons technology. The tank, firepower and speed.
It's like a tiny little oven.
The hand grenade turns trench warfare into a nightmare.
Pull the pin, and we're ready to go.
The first machine gun, the Maxim.
And changed the world of firearms and warfare forever.
Our first weapon shows how killing became a mechanized process during the 19th and 20th centuries. Firearms were introduced in the Middle Ages, and ever since the military has kept trying to shoot faster and more effectively. The more bullets that hit the enemy on the battlefield, the more likely you are to win. But there is one problem. Reloading the weapons is cumbersome. In 1866, Hiram Maxim, an American engineer, tries out a rifle. It is tedious to have to reload after every shot, and his shoulder aches from the hard recoil of the weapon. Maxim, who is actually an electrical engineering specialist, has an idea. Could the energy from the recoil be used to reload? In 1881, he travels to Europe, where supposedly a friend gave him a crucial piece of advice.
And his friend tells him, "Do you know how you could make some real money?" And Hiram Maxim says, "How?" And Maxim's friend says, "Invent a weapon system that will allow Europeans to kill each other faster." And unfortunately, Maxim takes this advice.
At that moment, Europe is at peace. But it seems like only a matter of time before the next Great War breaks out. 3 years later, Maxim debuts his new weapon. As long as the trigger remains depressed, the Maxim gun fires without stopping. Without almost any recoil, since that force is used for the reloading process. We want to test how this automatic weapon really works. Karin Machnow is a weapons expert from Phoenix, Arizona in the US. On the shooting range, she shows us an original Maxim gun in action.
This gun was also known as the Grim Reaper and the Devil's Paintbrush, and changed the world of firearms and warfare forever.
A special component of the weapon is the water-cooled barrel.
You've got the water jacket. We have an area that you could unscrew to put the water inside the gun. It held about 4 liters of water. When the barrel gets very hot, which it does with sustained fire, that water would boil, steam would come up, condense through the steam tube, and come out through the front part of the gun here where we have a hole. So this would keep the gun cool.
Karin wants to put the machine gun to the test using a historical example from 1908. Her target, 10 paint cans. Can she hit them all in 10 seconds?
Okay, I'm ready to fire.
In just 10 seconds, Karin fired around 100 shots. But how does the weapon really work? The key principle behind the mechanism. The recoil slides a carriage which ejects the empty cartridge case downwards, while at the same time putting a new cartridge into position. As long as the barrel stays cool and the shooter keeps the trigger depressed, the former nuisance of the recoil now provides the momentum for automatic reloading. Hiram Maxim has created the first automatic machine gun. A cartridge belt with 250 rounds of ammunition is attached to the heavy weapon, and with belt changes, it is possible to shoot up to 600 shots per minute.
Another interesting component about the gun is that it had a rate of fire of about 892 meters per second. Quite a devastating weapon. Didn't involve a crank mechanism. It was fully automatic. And again, that's what makes this gun so completely devastating and so revolutionary and so far ahead of its time.
As an advertising demo, Maxim uses bullets to cut down a tree, as seen here in 1890, accompanied by Chinese emissaries. But is this photo evidence trustworthy? To check it out, we'll begin our next experiment. An assistant buries a tree trunk in the ground.
And I'm not sure how long it's going to take to actually cut this tree down. So let's see what happens.
Karin Mack now fires away at the tree trunk with the Maxim gun. The mechanism jams, something that happened in isolated instances in the past, and happens to the historical weapon even more now after 100 years of operation.
It's not going back. This is what happens with 100-year-old pieces of equipment. Right, but let's go and take a look at what it did do.
What kind of damage did the Maxim gun do to the tree trunk?
Well, if you come back here, it's actually pretty impressive. You can see just how much it's cleared out the back of the tree. But around here, there's still a ways to go. So had we been successful, this would have gone down. But old piece of equipment, unfortunately, would have been fun to see this happen. Didn't work out this time.
Our conclusion: the Maxim gun would actually have been able to penetrate and destroy a tree trunk. And the weapon also convinces the British military.
So it took that kind of fire into new spaces, and it became a key tool in the late 19th century in the pacification of areas outside Western Europe.
Omdurman, Sudan, 1898. One of the first missions to use the Maxim gun in combat. Followers of the Islamic Mahdi movement rebel against Egyptian foreign rule. When they meet on the Nile, the Mahdists far outnumber the Egyptian British army. But the British also have 20 new Maxim machine guns. The bloody toll of the battle, 48 dead on the British-Egyptian side. And an estimated 10,000 Mahdi fighters are killed. In the summer of 1914, World War I breaks out. The machine gun gives those on the defensive front a huge advantage over their attackers during combat.
It is man-portable. If you separate the barrel and the firing mechanism from the mounting and the ammunition, you can carry it one man at a time.
The machine gun becomes standard issue equipment for every European army.
In the First World War, everybody has Maxim guns. The German, Russian, Austrian and British Maxim gun are all based on the same patents. They all look essentially the same. They all do the same job in the same way. And Hiram Maxim and his company got the patent for that, and they took royalties on every single one of them. So they made a fortune out of everybody else having Maxim guns.
With a machine gun, a single soldier can kill hundreds of the enemy with just one finger on the trigger. The new weapons of World War I also bring with them unimaginable psychological stress. What does it mean to constantly look death in the eye? And what is triggered by killing dozens or even hundreds of other men? In war, one question has always pushed man to his limits. If commanded, will I be capable of killing? Evolution has turned us into social beings with deep-rooted inhibitions when it comes to killing. And that's a problem for the military. Studies show that many soldiers are afraid to kill even when they themselves are in danger.
Many men go through battle without firing their weapons effectively, some without firing them at all. This has been the case for as long as men have had the choice of whether to fire their weapons or not. One soldier does not equal one result. You need to know the soldier before you know what he's going to do.
To tackle this issue, training for new recruits includes a strong psychological component. Repetitive drills are designed to overcome fears and inhibitions. Don't think about it, just shoot.
It's about immersing people within that training to respond automatically to a situation, to not have that hesitation, which is the frontal part of our brain, rationalizing, saying, this is not a good thing to do, I'm not supposed to be doing this. If you can make that automatic, if you make that almost an animal reaction, this occurs, I respond in this way.
But even when pulling the trigger becomes automatic, killing takes its toll on soldiers, including those apparently unharmed. In World War I, doctors diagnosed the symptoms of shell shock as a merely physical reaction to the noises of constant fire. At the time, it is thought that loud sounds trigger minor concussions. Today, it is clear that war can cause serious mental disorders. After the Second World War, an entire generation deals with the psychological consequences of their experiences.
After World War II, we had men who didn't know what was happening to them. They fell to pieces if they survived the war and came home. Their families suffered, their relationships suffered, their health suffered, and it was not recognized. And if they showed weakness, they were considered weak. So people kept it within themselves.
Over decades, research into the psychological effects of war is sorely neglected. Well-founded studies do not take place until the 1960s. In 1980, the medical diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder is finally added to textbooks.
Once post-traumatic stress disorder began being recognized, men would realize that it wasn't them being weak, it wasn't them having an adverse reaction that none of their colleagues had. It was a completely normal reaction to witnessing such traumatic events. And once that was recognized, and then therefore treatment could follow, we now have a situation where families understand what their husbands, sons, daughters now are going through and recognize that they need that help.
With the introduction of the machine gun, mechanized warfare and the fear of being killed reaches a new level. The weapon dramatically alters the psychology of war. Engineer Hiram Maxim's invention forever changes the way that the world fights. And it also paves the way for another modern weapon, the hand grenade. The introduction of new weapons technology frequently results in fatal errors and avoidable massacres, especially at the beginning of World War I.
When the First World War broke out in 1914, the great armies of Europe thought that they would maneuver in a classical form using cavalry and infantry. They would set up set-piece battles in which whole armies engaged on a broad front. It rapidly became clear that firepower, both artillery firepower, infantry firepower, and particularly the machine gun, made it impossible for men to operate as they had in even 50 years before.
Machine guns and improved artillery claim high losses on both sides. Attacks without cover ultimately end as a bloodbath. After the devastating Battle of the Marne, both sides start digging. By the end of November, a continuous line of trenches runs all the way from the North Sea to Switzerland. Mobile warfare has turned into trench warfare. But what is the best way to effectively attack the enemy's narrow and hard-to-see trenches and bunkers? Artillery becomes a key weapon. The only way to defeat an enemy down in a trench is with ballistic fire. On both sides, a dense row of guns is positioned far behind the trenches. William Mills, an engineer in Birmingham, develops a new weapon for the trench soldiers. In 1915, the Mills bomb makes its way onto European battlefields. Mills' invention is no new idea. In the 16th century, transporting cannons is a problem. The soldiers need a lightweight weapon that can wreak havoc without too much effort. And the hand grenade is born.
The shape of these very early grenades resembles a pomegranate, hence the name.
The round, hard-skinned and many-seeded fruit becomes the namesake for the new weapon in the 17th century. A hollow clay jar is filled with gunpowder and metal slivers. A fuse ignites the explosive, and the sharp metal and clay fragments make their destructive impact.
17th and 18th century armies had elite soldiers called grenadiers who were generally big, tall fellows who could throw a grenade a long way.
They also changed their uniforms. These typical pointed Prussian hats, the grenadier hats, were made to look like this because, of course, if you were wearing a two-pointed hat, it would be a lot more difficult for you to throw a grenade.
With their hand grenades, the grenadiers stand at the ready on the front lines. But the weapon also has its pitfalls.
The grenade had to be lit. If the fuse went too quickly, the grenade would blow up before it was thrown. If it got dropped or anything like that, things could go wrong. And of course, if it was raining, it probably wouldn't work. So it was a rather temperamental weapon.
During the American Civil War, the next generation of hand grenades reaches the battlefields. An invention from William Ketchum eliminates the need to manually ignite the weapon. The grenade only needs to hit the impact fuse in the nose of the weapon in order to explode.
If the bomb lands on its side and doesn't detonate, then it stays relatively safe for a period of time. So, of course, the opponent can then take the grenade and throw it back to where it came from.
The latest hand grenade in 1915 is supposed to solve this problem. With historian Stephen Bull, we take a closer look at William Mills' invention. It has considerable advantages over its predecessors. It does not need to be manually ignited, and there is no unreliable impact fuse. The grenade is constructed using a perforated cast iron shell and filled with explosives.
The hand grenade was an old idea, but it received a new lease of life in the trenches of the First World War. The effect of an explosion in a confined space could be devastating.
The functioning principle of the hand grenade is that in the middle there's a fuse connected to the explosive charge. If the safety pin is pulled and the lever is released, then the tension of the spring hits the striker to ignite the fuse. 7 seconds later, it explodes. Combining portability with destructiveness, the hand grenade becomes a standard weapon during World War I. On the fronts of Flanders and France, an ingenious trench system is developed. A support trench is dug behind the main trench, connected to another passage known as a communication trench. The enemy is anywhere from 30 to a few hundred meters away, and the soldiers call the area separating the two sides no man's land. Hand grenades that land in a trench are terrifying, but changes to trench construction alleviate their devastating effects.
If a trench is straight, then shrapnel can fly far in one direction and potentially hit soldiers. So they thought if they dug the trenches in a zigzag shape, there would always be a corner nearby where a soldier could hide. And then shrapnel would only fly to the next corner and get stuck in the wall, and hopefully it wouldn't hit anyone.
Soldiers that are hit by fragments of a hand grenade often suffer life-threatening injuries. An effective drug to prevent gangrene has not yet been invented.
One of the key problems in trench warfare is the secondary infection following wounds because of the contaminated and dangerous nature of the ground that you're fighting over.
Sludgy ground, overflowing latrines, unwashed bodies, and decomposing corpses. Everyday life in the trenches is yet another burden for soldiers during the war.
They had to wear their clothes all the time, and worse still, they also had to keep their boots on. That meant the conditions were ideal for fungus to grow, and bacteria also grew. And the skin became really macerated and stayed moist and was quite fragile and very vulnerable.
The lack of hygiene makes it virtually impossible to treat hand grenade injuries in the trenches.
These fragments often had very small particles, so that meant even if you had a tiny wound, it could easily become inflamed because of unhygienic conditions. And if you didn't have the right medication, then you could go from barely having a wound at all to having a serious injury that gets infected. And the infection can then spread to lymph vessels, to blood vessels, and can even lead to blood poisoning.
If a shrapnel wound does heal, it's only a matter of time before the next attack. In 1917, the British Mills bomb goes into mass production. The Germans are also developing their own completely different hand grenade. While Mills grenades look like an egg, the German version is at the end of a wooden stick. And it functions differently. The British hand grenade is a fragmentation weapon, but the Germans have created an explosive weapon. With historian Stephen Bull, we want to explore the differences between these two types of grenade. The head of the stick grenade holds over 100 grams more explosive material than the egg version. The difference is the force of the explosion, not the radius of the projectile fragments, but it needs to have pinpoint accuracy. The German grenade's wooden stick is supposed to help with the aim.
So these are the two grenades that we'll be testing. They're both time-fused models. This one is the Soviet F1, a similar design to the Mills. This one is the German M24, steel hand grenade or stick grenade. Different philosophies, but is one better than the other, and why?
Which grenade will Stephen Bull be able to land closer to his target in just one throw? He tries out the Mills bomb first.
Quite small in the hand, like a large egg, really. Pull the pin, and we're ready to go.
The grenade lands about 5 meters from the target.
Not bad, a reasonable throw, but it's a little short of the target. The main effect from this, of course, would be the fragmentation.
Does throwing the stick grenade give a better result? It lands directly on our target.
So that was a good long throw, all the way to the target. It seems that that long stick gives you a bit of extra leverage for a long throw.
The explosion would have dangerous consequences for the enemy, but the sharp fragments of the egg hand grenade would also be devastating.
The M24 gave me a longer throw because its handle gave me greater leverage. But this was a weapon for blast, essentially a weapon for use in the open. The Soviet F1 is perhaps a little handier, but not quite such a long throw. Its main effect was fragmentation, and preferably in enclosed areas. So these are both good grenades, but they're designed for different purposes.
Both types of hand grenade make their mark in World War I. To a lesser extent, they continue to be used during World War II.
The Second World War is not such a great war for the hand grenade because wars tend to be now much more mobile, much more fluid. There are still trenches and bunkers to be cleared, but they're only part of rather than the whole of the war.
During World War I, 300 million hand grenades are produced by the German side alone, followed by 70 million in World War II. But the repercussions of their use remain the same. Those who survive a shrapnel wound often must resort to amputation to avoid death by gangrene. For decades, researchers have sought in vain to find a cure for gangrene. In 1928, Scottish bacteriologist Alexander Fleming accidentally discovers that pathogens no longer multiply when in close vicinity to a mold fungus. Fleming, together with biochemist Ernst Chain and pathologist Howard Florey, over the ensuing years worked to finally develop the first antibiotic, penicillin. The active ingredient prevents growing bacteria from completing their cell walls, effectively stopping them from spreading. Testing proves that the new drug is effective, but the British government is not ready to start the costly production. After joining the war, the United States step in and start mass production in 1942.
The need for penicillin at the front led to it becoming a top priority for the pharmaceutical industry. And they actively pushed this research because it was also a huge market for them.
The antibiotic is America's second most important project after the atomic bomb. Large advertisements proclaim, "Thanks to penicillin, he will come home." The Germans and Russians don't have access to the drug yet, and as a result, high numbers of their men die from infection. A strategic advantage for the Allies.
People don't die of disease, they get killed in battle. Whether that's morally uplifting or morally bankrupt, I don't know, but it does change the way that wars look. Wars are now about men dying in battle, and that's slightly easier to sell because it's heroic to die in battle. It's not heroic to die of diphtheria.
After the war, the expensive research also benefits the civilian population, and the advancement soon reaches the entire world. It's one case in which progress is accelerated by war.
What we're looking at is advancing on twin tracks. We're finding new ways of killing people in confined spaces and giving them horrific injuries which may become contaminated. At the same time, we're finding ways of dealing with those contaminations and healing people.
And for all armies, the hand grenade continues to be standard issue equipment. After 1945, it is used in practically every armed conflict.
Continues to be a very useful means of doing a job that nothing else does. You have a system of fighting in which you're going into individual buildings and clearing individual rooms, and the hand grenade is still the weapon of choice to clear the room.
A hand grenade is also developed for police without the fatal fragments. With a loud bang, blinding light, and dense smoke, stun or smoke grenades are hurled at criminals and even demonstrators. Their use is controversial. A legendary version of the thrown weapon owes its name to Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. During the Russo-Finnish War of 1939, Finnish soldiers used gas-filled bottles against their Soviet attackers, calling them Molotov cocktails, as an allusion to their opponent's propaganda.
The original hand grenade was a homemade bomb, and the Molotov cocktail is a later version of the homemade bomb. And it's a classic solution to the problem of resistance against armed force when you have no weapons. You have to make a weapon out of something that isn't a weapon. And throughout history, human ingenuity has resulted in the conversion of perfectly ordinary things into weapons in times of need.
Throwing something at the enemy, a reflex as old as mankind. The only thing that has changed is what we throw. In the trenches of World War I, the defensive side always has the advantage, and the result is years of bloodshed with barely any change to the lines of the front. But that will soon all change with the next great development in weapons technology, the tank. In ancient times and the Middle Ages, armor and speed already played a crucial role in weapons development. In examples such as the Chariot of powerful battering rams that could be used to attack a fortress. But the problem is drive. In the second half of the 19th century, the invention of the combustion engine opens up completely new directions for military technology. In 1906, in Austria-Hungary, the first tank is introduced with a rotating turret intended for both attack and defense. But its four-wheel drive proves to be not a match for the battlefields.
The wheel only rests on one point, which is a good thing because that minimizes friction and allows you to drive over the road with as little resistance as possible. But if your car ever got stuck in the mud, then you know that this is also a disadvantage, because with low friction, it's much harder to get a grip.
A spark of inspiration comes from agriculture. At the beginning of the 20th century, tractors with rotating tracks arrive on the fields, a method that the military quickly puts to use for themselves.
Tanks were constructed with a wide track that was like a wide belt, and that made the surface contact area significantly larger, so you could get through mud and you could also drive over holes much more easily.
When World War I breaks out, Winston Churchill, the British Naval Secretary, advocates the construction of tanks. On September the 15th, 1916, they're ready. In northern France, during the Battle of the Somme, the first British tanks are put into action. The hulking beasts can only move at a walking pace. The Mark I weighs close to 28 tons. Depending on the design, its 8-man crew operates either 2 cannons or 4 to 6 machine guns. At full throttle, the 6-cylinder petrol engine manages a speed of just 6 kilometers per hour. 49 of the world's first battle tanks are supposed to be deployed in battle. But on the first mission, there's already problems.
It has a relatively low-powered gasoline engine, which gives off fumes inside the vehicle. The machine itself is unbelievably unreliable, so less than half the vehicles are going to make it to the start line and actually get going on the day of battle. It really is only suitable for going a short distance at walking pace over to the enemy's trenches. That's all it's ever going to do.
The loud and massive vehicle still nevertheless terrifies the enemy.
German soldiers were absolutely flabbergasted by this mechanical thing crawling towards them, which seemed to be bulletproof. The first time you saw one, they were terrifying. The second time, they were frightening. And the third time, they were slightly predictable.
The armor itself isn't thick enough to provide too much protection against direct artillery fire. And the Germans quickly realized that if they moved close enough to the tanks, they could fire through the observation slits, and they could set the fuel tanks on fire.
The tank's debut isn't enough to decide the war, but it is a convincing idea. Now every army in the world wants tanks, even the Germans, who are forbidden to do so by the 1919 peace treaty. They proceed anyway, and before long, Hitler's German Wehrmacht is equipped with entire armies of tanks. September the 1st, 1939. German tanks invade Poland and World War II begins. And with it comes the era of the so-called Blitz Wars, during which tanks become a decisive weapon. With tank invasions, the Germans quickly conquer half of Europe. By the end of June in 1940, Hitler has conquered Paris. Just 20 years earlier, the French and the Germans had waged war in the trenches for years. Now the Western campaign takes only 6 weeks.
The enemy couldn't respond because every time they responded, the Germans had already moved. So slow, lumbering responses from the British and the French in particular meant that by the time they realized what had happened, it was over and they were already retreating.
1 year later, German troops invade the Soviet Union. Hitler believes that just like in the West, victory will be swift thanks to the lightning speed of his tank attacks. At first, it seems as if all is going according to plan. But Soviet leadership recovers from the initial shock. Their country is huge and a counterattack is already being prepared. And it comes in the form of groundbreaking weapons technology. Almost 6 meters long, 3 meters wide, and weighing 26 tons. With wide tracks that make the Soviet T-34 mobile even in difficult terrain. The 3-meter-long cannon provides firepower superior to the German models. And at full speed, the steel Colossus can travel up to 55 kilometers per hour. Weapons expert Stephen Bull wants to take a closer look at the T-34. In 1941, the efficiency of the armor took the Germans completely by surprise.
Around the front here, the armor was 45 millimeters thick. But because it was so well sloped, a shell had to pass through 60 millimeters of armor.
How does it feel to drive a T-34? With an experienced tank crew, Stephen tests it out on the terrain.
So the T-34 had a crew of 4 men. There goes the driver, and the gunner, the loader, and last but not least, the commander.
This post-war version of the T-34 is still completely road-ready. From the outside, the tank seems huge, but inside, space is actually limited.
It's like a tight little oven, a noisy, tight little oven. And the reason I'm wearing this is because I'm expecting that my skull will be banging against the inside of the armour any moment. In my left hand, I have the lanyard to pull the mechanism of the main gun, and there should be a machine gun over my left-hand shoulder.
Tasks inside the T-34 are clearly distributed. In real combat, everyone knows what they need to do.
You're now down in the forward gunner's seat.
looking back up at me from the position next to the driver. Just below you is the escape hatch. So if it gets bad, you can drop out through the floor. Hopefully we won't need to do that.
Now it heads onto the terrain. Can the T-34 handle the course and overcome the obstacles? The commander supervises the exercise. No problem for a steel colossus. In World War II, the Soviet Union manufactures more than 50,000 T-34 tanks, double the amount of every type of German tank put together. Hitler's Wehrmacht attempts to make up for what they lack in tank numbers through a technically superior model. In 1942, a new tank called Tiger goes into mass production. At 26 tons, the T-34 runs at a speed of more than 50 kilometers per hour and is extremely maneuverable. The Tiger is more than twice as heavy and can only go 30 kilometers per hour. But it comes with much stronger weaponry. In a one-on-one battle, this would have advantages. Summer 1943. The Germans prepare for a major attack on the front in Kursk, roughly 500 kilometers south of Moscow.
The Soviets get intelligence of this operation and prepare for it, and they use minefields, anti-tank traps, and a whole series of systems to channel the German attack into predefined killing grounds where they can mass their own tanks.
July the 12th, 1943, the climax of the Battle of Kursk. More than 7,000 tanks and 2 million soldiers take part in the biggest tank battle of World War II.
The German tanks have an advantage in long-range firepower. The Russians have an advantage in mobility and close-quarters fighting, so they set up battles that suit their tanks rather than the German tanks.
It is Hitler's last great attempt to defeat the Soviet army in a pivotal battle.
The largest tank battle in history is over, and so is the German offensive against the Soviet Union. This is the last battle where the Germans attack. From now on, the Soviets will attack and the Germans will defend.
The era of victories won by tank attacks has ended. Constant improvements in anti-tank weapons and air attacks have turned the hunters into the hunted. The successes of the World War II tanks take these developments into account. T-84 Oplot, the latest generation of Russian tanks. Since 2009, they've been part of the Ukrainian Army's arsenal. On behalf of the Malyshev Weapons Factory, former military personnel carry out various tests at a training site in Kharkiv, eastern Ukraine.
So this is the Oplot, the latest successor to the T-84, and it's got some amazing features. It's got explosive reactive armor, and it's got a 125mm gun, a smoothbore that can actually fire missiles. But perhaps most amazingly, it's a flying tank. It moves at 70 kilometers an hour on the road.
Stephen Bull wants to test whether the 50-ton tank can really pull this off. A military truck goes full throttle over the terrain, but it soon becomes clear that the T-84 Oplot can not only catch up with the truck, it can also effortlessly pass it. With its wide tracks on uneven ground, the tank will always be superior to a wheeled vehicle. But how destructive is this kind of modern tank? Stephen Bull and our team are there for the tank's test. The front of the current conflict in eastern Ukraine is about 300 kilometers away.
So the guys have just bombed up the tank and they've put in 3 rounds, and these are 2-part rounds. The projectile is fin stabilized, and behind it is the main charge of explosive.
The target is a solid stone wall. The team also sets up explosive gasoline drums behind it. The T-84's gun aims to destroy the target from a distance of 1.6 kilometers. From a distance of 1,650 meters, the tank reliably hits its target.
Well, that was a gut-shaking shot. You could see the flash. I could certainly feel the pressure going through my head. And I'm glad they warned me to keep my mouth open, because otherwise I'm quite sure something would pop inside there. So this wreckage here is what's left of the target. And you can see it's still burning, so I'm not going to go any closer than this, because if that goes off, this could be pretty serious.
But how does the modern tank handle uneven terrain? Stephen Bull goes along for the ride. The obstacle, 2 car wrecks. The 51-ton T-84 slides effortlessly over the vehicles. In the next test, the tank faces a burning roadblock. The tank seems to make it through the flames without effort as well. But in reality, it can only withstand a strong fire for a short amount of time.
I won't be doing that again in a hurry. When you were inside, some of the smoke and a few of the embers were being sucked in through some of the filtration system, and I could feel it getting very smoky in there. And I'm very glad that he got the lid open when he did. It certainly wasn't pleasant.
A tank that protects against any circumstance is only an illusion. The crews are actually no safer than the infantry. Tanks are as powerful as their myth only when they are used against civilians, whether in 1953 in East Berlin, 1968 in Prague, or in other places where dictatorships take actions against their own people. Today, as a tool of suppression, tanks are still the ideal weapon.
It's a powerful mechanical beast which threatens your security. It also makes you look big and strong. You know, it's the war elephant of the modern world. They're symbols of power as well as being powerful.
On modern battlefields, airplanes and missiles determine the victor. During the Cold War, the average estimated survival time of a tank crew was only a few minutes. And the role of large and powerful military equipment as a deterring symbol has long since shifted to other types of weapons. In 2002, American weapons engineers developed what is known as the mother of all bombs, a 9-meter-long bomb with an explosive charge of 11 tons of TNT.
The idea is, of course, that nuclear weapons can do it bigger and better than anything conventional, but you're not allowed to use them without starting a world war. So let's build the biggest one we can, short of a nuclear weapon.
15 years after its development under President Trump, the mother of all bombs is used for the first time. On April 13, 2017, it hits the site of the terrorist militia of the Islamic State in Afghanistan. Every building within a 150-meter radius is destroyed. the impact of the attack's media message takes the foreground, but the actual military gain is controversial.
What does it add to the arsenal of the world? Very little. There is a sense in which military organizations competing with each other, that's not a competition with anybody else, that's internal, and that's about their share of the budget voted through in Washington. So having that bomb makes them look good in Washington, and I suspect that's largely what's behind this.
This rivalry also plays out internationally. Russia's military debuts a male counterpart, the father of all bombs. In 2007, Russian state television broadcasts an alleged test of the vacuum bomb. But in this case as well, the bomb has a greater symbolic use as a propaganda than as an actual military tool.
During the explosion, the oxygen in the air burns to create an immense vacuum, and the pressure in the surrounding area drops abruptly. So if I've already inhaled and the air in my lungs is at normal atmospheric pressure, then it suddenly expands and my lungs burst.
For thousands of years, arms races have been a dangerous aspect of war. And despite any assurances that new weapons are only intended to deter an opponent, they are often still used, unleashing their full power of destruction.